Hello. Greetings. So, once again, you braved the incredible weather. It's still sunny outside. It hasn't started raining. And here you are ready to sit in the dark. So I admire you all immensely, and you really are in for a treat. My name's Ike Kang. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Curator here, and this is Art Matters. And today is a really special day, especially for me, because I get to welcome one of my favorite people in the entire world. And I'm sorry to sound like an 8-year-old, but she's literally my best friend from graduate school. And she also happens to be an incredible scholar. Her name is Melissa Hyde, and she is professor of art history and distinguished teaching scholar at the University of Florida. And she's been there for quite some time now. And we were at Berkeley together, it's true, but she's gone on to have such an illustrious career as an art historian, and she really is acknowledged today internationally as one of the leading art historians of the 18th century, especially 18th century French painting. She's been working extensively on pastel. That is the subject that I think in part she will be exploring today. Her first major book was published back in 2006, and was on the subject of her dissertation, the Rococo artist François Boucher. She's also gone on to co-edit several books that are collections of essays on 18th century art, the most recent being Thinking Women and 18th Century Art, Strategic Reinterpretations. Her forthcoming book, which we're really excited about, is called Painted by Herself, Marie-Suzanne Giroux, Madame Roselyne, the Forgotten Academicienne, and that should be coming out soon, we hope. She's also the co-editor of a book series on 18th century women artists published by Lunt Humphreys and the Getty. Melissa's received so many academic distinctions, including fellowships at the Clark Art Institute, the Getty Research Institute, the Institut National de l'Histoire de l'Art in Paris, and most recently at CASVA, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. She has served as past president of both the Historians of 18th Century Art and Architecture and of the American Society for 18th Century Studies. We're so looking forward to her insights into an oddly under-addressed aspect of the Rococo, which is significant in that it is under-addressed, and that's the significance of the prevalence of the color pink. So in this lecture, she's customized it for us, and it's called Men in Pink, 18th Century French Portraiture. So with that, please help me welcome her to the stage.
I guess I don't need to turn off this mic. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the invitation. It's glorious to be here at a long haul this past semester, and Santa Barbara is gorgeous, and I've been having a wonderful time, and so I'm delighted to be able to share this work with you. Okay. You can see it all right. Charm, politeness, tenderness, sweetness. Oops, I did the childhood, the romantic, and the feminine. According to public opinion surveys in Europe and the United States, these are some of the most prevalent terms in the lexical universe of the color pink. Of this cluster of associations, surely the link to femininity is the most conventional. For more than any other hue, pink is notionally feminine. This idea is so deeply ingrained in the cultural imaginary, and not only of Western worlds, that it can literally be news that pink hasn't always been a girly color. In the United States and the UK at least, the gendered associations of this color do not seem to have been really settled until after World War II. We ourselves are living in a time when the gendered connotations of pink are again being unsettled, as are the categories of gender themselves. Pink has sometimes played a role in the rejection of gender binaries or functioned as a visual means of laying claim to queer identities. It can be a sign of gender fluidity, or at least of gender nonconformity. And when worn by straight men, it might mean alternative demonstrations of masculinity or the rejection of toxic masculinity. Men might wear pink to show that they're feminists or to support a cause. Nowadays, a boy or a man who wears pink is making some kind of statement. I think that historically, that's always been the case. Whether we're talking about Jay Gatsby and his famous pink suit, or the scrumptious, peachy pink velvet suit worn by the man in this 18th century pastel portrait by Jean-Baptiste Perronneau. Since the 1930s, some shades of pink have been associated with the archetypal femininity, most famously represented in the 1950s by Mamie Eisenhower. Some examples of that. I have a Mamie pink bathroom in my 1950s house. It's a color that's near and dear to my heart. But pink could also be shocking, though no less associated with femininity, as Elsa Schiaparelli and Marilyn Monroe understood extremely well. But this is one of the reasons I think that pink has been deployed so effectively in terms of queer gender politics. Think about Billy Porter again, for example. But pink can be subversive and political in other ways as well, as attested by its use in this intervention in national politics in the former Czechoslovakia, or by the sapeurs, gentlemen of transgression in Bakongo. It's the signature color of the pink sari revolution, a hugely effective women's movement in India. In the US and the UK, feminists have had a love-hate relationship with the color. Remember Pussy Hats in 2017 and the controversy that followed. Before that, the Pink Stinks campaign against pinkification that was begun in the UK was carried out. And since 2016, many women have embraced shades of the so-called millennial pink as a feminist, i.e. not a girly color. Though no one can agree exactly on what color millennial pink actually is, it's somewhere in this family. The Guardian noted in 2017 that millennial pink is very close to skin color, if you have that skin color. This is a telling caveat that's very close to the mark for my purposes today. For it's my argument that since the 18th century, and even before, pink has been intimately associated with skin color, a term that only came into usage in the 18th century. That is, pink, like the color white itself, has long been normatively, though implicitly, understood as emblematic of white, Europid skin, whether natural or cosmetically enhanced. For pink also has a history of being intimately bound up with cosmetics, usually women's cosmetics. And this relationship to white skin is one of the ways that pink has played an abiding role in the definition of race as a matter of skin color, which, as recent scholarship has shown, was also an 18th century development. In our own time, as in the past, pink continues to be widely regarded as the generic color of white skin, though in recent years, various shades of pink have been used transgressively by celebrities like Nicki Minaj and Rihanna to challenge racialized norms of beauty as well as gender. Though it's not to be the only concern of my talk today, questions about the relationship between pink and race are threaded through it, as one of my interests here has to do with the role of pink in the construction of whiteness at the very moment when modern conceptions of race were emerging. These questions build on my past work, which Ike mentioned, which focus on how pink came to be identified with the feminine in the 18th century in France and contributed to the definition of normative gender binaries of masculine and feminine as part of a critical reaction against Rococo art. These are matters that I'll touch on today as I offer some reflections on how gender, race, and the color pink can be understood to intersect in French portraiture of the 18th century, particularly in the portrait of Olivier Journoud that I showed you a moment ago. So I want to get at these questions at these issues by way of some very basic but actually quite complicated questions. First of all, what did it mean? What did pink mean in the 18th century? And I think, as in our own time, pink was manifestly polyvalent in the 18th century. What colors were comprehended by pink? Who did or didn't embrace this color and why? And in light of the complexities and nuances of pink, what might it have meant for a racially white Frenchman to wear this notionally feminine color or to have himself depicted wearing it? How did the material aspects of pink pigments used in art and fashion affect its meaning? And what was considered pink anyway? Now, Michel Pastoureau, the distinguished historian of color in Europe, has asserted that the 18th century invented pink. And while in certain respects this is very true, women and men did wear pink and know pink long before that, even if they did not yet call it that. They didn't yet use the word pink or even have a word for the color. And what I'm going to do now is just run through very briefly a quick kind of survey of people in pink before the 18th century, just to demonstrate this point. So I just have chosen a selection of some of my favorites that are kind of conspicuously examples of people wearing pink, men and women. So 16th century examples, British and Italian, some more Italian examples, French example, 17th century French example, lovely Swedish example, some kind of livery. I haven't quite figured out who these guys are, but they are sort of spectacular in their pink raiments. The Dutch liked pink for boys and for women, and also for men, as you see in one of my favorite paintings of men in pink. But I think Pastoureau is right about the 18th century having invented pink, particularly from the point of view of language, which I'll come back into in a moment. But over the course of the 18th century, pink really did become extremely fashionable, and one of the most famous examples of this in the 18th century is the pink dress in Watteau's painting of Gersain's shop sign. And pink attained a level of visibility in painting, in dress, in decorative arts, and even in literature that rivaled our own. Here's a famous example from literature. In France, pink is the color par excellence of the Rococo, one of the main icons of the Rococo, Fragonard's Swing from 1763. Both the color and the artistic idiom are intimately associated with Madame de Pompadour, the famous mistress of Louis XV. But even before she came on the scene in the 1750s, it was a color of elite white Frenchness, worn by women, children, and men. So my point here is that pink wasn't a priori a gendered color. It became one and played a role in defining social and racial identities. The 18th century did invent pink from the point of view of language, at least in English and in French. During this period, pink, or rose in French, began to be used as a standalone term for color. Long before that, however, couleur de rose, the color of rose, was a phrase that was used widely in French. Very often, couleur de rose appeared in literary descriptions of fabric, of clothing, or in texts related to art. And couleur de rose was also used in the domain of natural history to describe various flora and fauna, especially birds, flowers, and shells. But above all, the expression couleur de rose was consistently evoked to the point of cliché in conjunction with the white of lilies to describe the ideal coloring, the pink cheeks, and the fair skin of a beautiful woman. An ideal, it goes without saying, that enshrined a racialized ideal of whiteness and femininity, or perhaps maybe even more accurately, enshrined an ideal of femininity as whiteness. And I'm showing you here two paintings by Drouet of subsequent mistress of Louis XV after Pompadour, Madame du Barry, who was famous for her dazzlingly white skin and rosy, uncosmeticized rosy cheeks that were described as rose petals having fallen into milk. So this also, like, we've got the lilies and roses, but also milk in there somehow. So the connection between pink and complexion or flesh tones and female beauty was, in painting particularly, was of long standing. And one example of this is to be found in a treatise, a painting of 1669 by a man named by Antoine Leblond de la Tour, which defined a woman's beautiful skin tone as beautiful, fresh, and white, by which he meant not the tones of white plaster seen in women's cosmetics, but as he put it, a rose complexion. So a beautiful white complexion was a beautiful rose complexion. And in the Mignard painting that I'm showing you here, I just want to call to your attention the marmoreal pallor of the Duchess of Portsmouth's skin, whose whiteness is purposely contrasted with the dark skin tones of the young black servant girl who attends her. And portraits of this kind, which show women with their enslaved black servants, were formative contributions to the emerging conception of white racial superiority based on skin. And I'm just briefly going to show you another a fashion print that relates to this point, and you can read the caption there that makes the purpose of the contrast between the enslaved page and the woman very explicit in terms of race. Leblond understood complexion as, so this theorist that I'm referring to a moment ago, is understood complexion as a marker of gender. And you can really see the contrast between the man's complexion and the woman's in the painting I'm showing you by l'Argilière. This theorist treated a rosy pink complexion as a characteristic that distinguished women from men. But pink was also starting at this point to play a role in definitions of race in terms of skin color. In Leblond's treatise and in portraits such as these, pink is becoming the generic color of white skin and or a sign of raced whiteness. So perhaps you're wondering what exactly was meant by rose or couleur de rose. I've been pondering the question of what counts as pink myself in the course of doing this work. Are these all examples of pink? Are these all examples of pink? You know, there's a whole spectrum. I haven't quite made a definitive determination for myself, but I can tell you that the position of pink on the color axis varied greatly over time. By the 18th century, though, it was understood chromatically as a mixture of white and red, which is why one really can't talk about pink without talking about red first, which I'm going to do for a couple of minutes here. The range of reds that could be produced with 18th century materials was extremely varied. Some verge on purple or magenta, while others incline towards browns and russets. So naturally, so do the pinks that derive from those reds. In seeking to understand what hues were understood as pink in the 18th century, it's worth noting that like many colors, which are tied to materials and objects of that color, the French rose derives from a specific referent, the flower of that name, the rose. This word for the color rose comes from the Latin rosa, for the flower. The English word for the color pink also derives from flowers, not roses, but from flowers belonging to the genus Dianthus, known colloquially as pinks, or carnations, carnations, œillets in French. Now, not all pinks were pink-colored, but a French gardening treatise, I don't know if you'll be able to read this, but a French gardening treatise of 1697 helpfully classified dianthuses by colors and places pink pinks under the heading of the color of roses and flesh. So I'm very interested in this evocation of pinkness and flesh together. The French word for flesh could also mean complexion. What I'm getting at here is the fact that the English definition of the color pink is semantically linked to the idea of rose pink and to flesh or complexion as descriptors of racially white skin. And I think that's something that's quite thematized in this, another example of these page paintings. Then there are pink roses themselves, which had been cultivated in Europe at least since antiquity and much longer in Asia. One variety of pink rose that was ubiquitous in the 18th century was the centifolia, also known as the rose de Provence, or cabbage rose. Though it had been widely depicted in floral still lifes since the late 16th century, really since the beginning of still life painting itself, this was the signature flower also of the Rococo. The flower was beloved by Pompadour and Marie Antoinette. You see depicted in the two portraits here, Pompadour on the left, Marie Antoinette on the right. And the flower, when it appears in paintings like these, is almost always depicted in shades of pink that are ranging from this very delicate, pale pink, which inclines towards kind of peachy tones, to a deep rose pink that verges on red. But in paintings such as these, the centifolia was used again and again as a visual analogy to female complexion, whether natural or cosmetically enhanced. If we delve a little more into the domain of natural history, we can get a further sense of the nuances of rose in 18th century parlance. At the time, there was a growing interest in shell collecting that vastly expanded the repertoire of pinkness, as colonial trading made new specimens available, something that artists like Anne-Valérie Coster and Émilie Bougneux were able to capitalize on in their work. Scientific publications describe the properties of shells in meticulous detail. In fact, scientific accounts of seashells of various types surpass even discussions of botany in their use of rose or couleur rose as descriptors. Myriad varieties of pink are also to be found in auction sale catalogs of shells. One sale on 1756 contains over 30 references to different shades of pink. So this sort of vastly expanded lexicon of pinkness, thanks to these various sources. I'll just pause for a moment here to reflect on the affinities between shell pink, the shell pink of the woman in Rosselin's magnificent portrait, and the shells in which she delights. Pink is really the unifying theme in the woman's dress, in her complexion, and in her intellectual preoccupations. So I want to call to your attention here how the very language used to describe pink things was made possible by colonialism, as were some of the materials from which pink derived. There is a bewildering range of variables that affected the hues of pink that are to be found in 18th century material and visual culture. The first factor is what materials were used to make the pigments in dyes and paints, or lakes, and pastel crayons. In essence, these pinks came from the same materials that were used to make reds, as I've already mentioned. The traditional sources of reds were minerals like vermilion, made from cinnabar, and red ochre and madder, which came from the root of a plant. These are some of the sources of red I just enumerated. Expensive and difficult to produce, deep saturated reds were colors associated with luxury, with power, and authority. In the early modern period, one of the key dye stuffs that was used to produce the most sumptuous reds in fabric and in paint came from insects in the scale family, which included kermes and cochineal. Cochineal is the source of carmine, which before the 17th century came largely from Poland and Armenia. But these raw materials that made up carmine were labor-intensive and very hard to obtain, and they were complicated to work with in the dyeing process, making red fabrics very, very expensive. The same dye stuffs were also used as colorants in painters' pigments, and in fact, these pigments were often derived from the textiles themselves. But in the 16th century, the Portuguese began to export another important source of red, Brazil wood, which gave the colony of Brazil its name. And like the other red colorants, were used to create a range of pinks. Both carmine and Brazil wood would become key ingredients in rouge too, by the way. So there's a commonality in the materials, the painterly materials, and in the stuff of cosmetics and clothing, in fact. Also in the 16th century, the Spanish discovered, I use that term advisedly, an extremely plentiful new source of cochineal in Mexico, where it had been cultivated and used since the early Mesoamericans. By the early 17th century, a true craze for this so-called perfect red began as it became more available, though always as a luxury associated with elite culture. And it came from New Spain, where it was produced by conquered indigenous peoples. In the 18th century, new sources of Brazil wood were to be found in other European colonies, produced by slave labor that made it much more widely available, thanks to the expanding global consumer economy. So it's important, I think, to take into account the material aspects of pigment, which play a key role in their use and also in producing their meaning. Children of both sexes were dressed in pink, but it is clear, it's not always obvious which ones are boys and which ones are girls. I think everything I'm showing you here are paintings of boys, in fact. But it is clear that throughout the 18th century, it was a favorite color for women across the classes, from royal princesses to artists' wives and actresses. I haven't labeled these, but we just know that we're seeing a cross-section in terms of class of women who are dressed in this fashionable pink. So it's a favorite color for their cheeks as much as for their attire. It was also fashionable across Europe and beyond, and here I'm showing you English examples of women in pink, American, Mexican, Spanish, German, and Swedish examples. So it's a pan-European and beyond phenomenon in terms of fashion. It was specifically, though, at least in France, a color for young women. And in France, at any rate, women who were unwise enough to wear it were often the subject, mature women who were unwise enough to wear it were often the subject of censure and mockery. In works like these of the sort of more appropriately, sort of conventionally appropriately aged sitter wearing pink, these are works, I think, that kind of thematize cosmetics and rouge and dressing in pink. So pink was common enough to be quite conventional, but not meaningless, let's say. For in addition to signifying the blossom of youth, and perhaps also other things like sexual maturity or availability, pink was a color that signified whiteness. And just as a quick aside, I'll mention that these are two of the very few images I've seen that depict people of color wearing pink. Paintings like this one by Lancret suggest that there is more to pink dresses and rosy cheeks than the conventional expressions of femininity and youth. And I'll just add as a further aside that by the middle of the 18th century, these kinds of images really go out of fashion. And it has been convincingly argued, nonetheless, that portraits such as these, by Alexandre Rosselin, where no African servant is present, the white dress does the same kind of ideological work, not through the contrast between light and dark skin, but through analogy between skin and fabric. And I would just call to your attention how the dazzling portrait of one of the most glamorous women in Parisian high society, in this portrait of this woman, the Comtesse d'Egmont, the artist highlights the similarities between the creamy whiteness of the Countess's skin and the luminous silk satin of her dress. I want to suggest that dressing in pink could similarly function to codify a racial ideal of whiteness. As historians of 18th century fashion know very well, the adult wearers of pink were not all women. This is a fact that tracks with many textual sources. Though for the most part, the textual descriptions of men who wear pink, or even just pink accessories, are satirical and critical. In this critical literature, men who have a taste for pink, and especially for wearing it, are identified with a social type known as a petit maître, sort of a synonym for it is sort of like the fop, right, or the dandy. The object of social satire and criticism, the petit maître was often regarded as a vain social butterfly who flitted from boudoir to salon. The petit maître exchanged flirtatious gossip and fashion tips with ladies of high society, sharing their manners and their frivolous tastes and preoccupations, especially those of the dress and the toilette. In Paris, the moralist Louis-Antoine Caraccioli noted in 1770 that there was such a fanaticism for the toilette that through it the two sexes were soon confounded. The chevalier appeared as effeminate as the ladies themselves, and like them, he had his powders, his beauty spots, his perfumes, his cosmetics, double sleeves trimmed with lace followed, and their suits were of every color. And though Caraccioli doesn't specify pink, I dare say that some of these colorful suits were pink. Though the equation of effeminacy and homosexuality was a stereotype that was beginning to take shape at this time, in Caraccioli's account, the effeminacy of the petit maître comes from what he describes as too much commingling with women, something that is satirized here in this image of Cupid as a petit maître. And it comes as a result of confounding men and women, of a lack of difference between them. And I think that if we had contemporary criticism about these two works together, which we don't, but I think critics might have said that the young man in the portrait on the right shared too much of the taste of women in his dress and appearance. In most accounts, though, the ambiguously gendered, so what the 18th century would call effeminate petit maître, is unambiguously heterosexual. Contributing to what critics called their air of effeminacy was the petit maître's liking for color in general, but especially for pink, whether that meant the rosy coloring of his cosmetically enhanced complexion or a liking for pink in dress and accoutrements. Some examples of contemporary fashion plates. As we'll see in a minute, the taste for pink in the visual arts was also partly attributed to the petit maître. But my point here is that for French critics, pink and effeminacy were not necessarily associated with homosexuality. However, the association between pink and femininity and the wrong kind of what we might think of, they would describe as the wrong kind of masculinity, aided in the construction and enforcement of normative ideals of gender and sexuality. And I think we can see intimations of this in the Rosselin portrait I showed you a moment ago, where you have these juxtapositions between active and passive, the husband standing, the woman sitting. They're differentiated coloristically in their clothing, in their complexions. And these are binaries of gender that would really become, would be epitomized 30 years later in David's Oath of the Horatii without the same kind of color encoding, I would say here. He's not big on pink, unsurprisingly. Although David does have a Rococo moment, which I don't have time to share with you here, early in his career. But where Caraccioli tempered his mockery of the petit maître with a certain archness and wit, Sébastien Mercier, the author of the famous Tableau de Paris, which was published in 1788, took a much more fractious tone in his ridicule of men in pink. He reserved special derision for the use of pink in French military uniforms, describing in detail a uniform that sounds very much like that of the regiment of the Dauphin Dragon, which you see in this portrait, worn by the Dauphin Louis de France. This green, Mercier describes this green coat with a pink lining, and he grumpily dismisses the uniform as a costume for a ball and as bizarre and effeminate and more suited for the ballet rather than the battlefield. To be sure, there were plenty of men in pink in the ballet and the theater, but pink was also a fashionable color for men to wear outside of costume balls and theater. More fashion plates. I think I showed you these before. If it had been widely regarded as a ridiculous or effeminate color in France, it would hardly have been used in military uniforms, nor would Louis XVI have been portrayed in such a spectacularly pink coat in images such as this, such as the ones I'm showing you here. So pink and its cognates were worn, I would say, seriously by men, in France at least, in life and in visual representations of them. But it was always just unusual enough to be noteworthy when they had themselves thus portrayed. And it was therefore meaningful in ways that I'll be coming back to. The refrain about feminized men and the women who made them that way was not limited to social criticism like Caraccioli's, but extended to critiques of literature and art in which complaints about pink featured prominently. A key moment in the history of the 18th century, history of 18th century French art criticism, came in 1747 with the publication of a pamphlet by a man named Etienne Lafont de Saint-Yenne, which was really for the first time offered critical judgments about art exhibited at the Salon. And this was, in essence, the beginning of a critical reaction against the Rococo and the sort of, very strident promotion of neoclassical ideals in the context of salon criticism. Among other things, Lafont was concerned about the undue influence of women over the visual arts, and he took the number of portraits of women that he took to be of no special consequence at the Salon of 1746 as an indication of the undue influence of women over the visual arts. And he was the first to sound another theme that would be taken up subsequently by many other anti-Rococo critics, and that was an objection to the overuse of pink in paintings by artists Boucher and Natoire. Their pink, said Lafont, was feeble and in accordance with trivial and fashionable taste. He went on to say that complexions of their figures were very pale and at the same time insipid, adding that this is the general tint of nearly all of our productions nowadays, in letters as well as in painting. Everything is the color of roses and lasts about as long. So objections to Boucher's use of pink would be a continuing theme in the criticism of his work, not least of all in works like this, which he painted for Madame de Pompadour. In the 1780s, a full decade after Boucher's death, he was still singled out as the man largely to blame for the made-up, illuminated coloring and the use of pink that had long weakened the French school through its softness, all of the paintings of our artists. So this use of pink has effeminized the French school, according to this critic. So pink, in other words, became a metonymy for art judged artificial and immoral. And by extension, critiques of this color were inextricably linked to attacks on fashionable elites associated with the mannered elegance of Rococo art, in which pink figured so prominently. The criticisms were directed particularly at women, most particularly Pompadour, an unrepentant lover of pink, but also directed at petits maîtres and anyone who shared their bad taste and love of cosmetic artifice. In other words, anti-Rococo critics constructed pink as feminine and as effeminate and inflected it with specific connotations of class. People who embraced pink may well have thought of it as having many of the same meanings as of the red from which it derived. But thanks to reformist critics, especially during the second half of the century, pink widely came to be thought of instead as a pale, attenuated version of red and was reviled as feminine or queer, disempowered, and devalued. One of the chief architects of reform of the arts on the institutional level was, ironically, the Comte d'Angevilliers, whom you see in these two slides, who had himself pictured not once but twice by different artists in these splendid suits of purple pink. So the objections to pink don't seem to have extended to his personal appearance. Nonetheless, pink, like Rococo art itself, came to be understood as a sign of social disorder, of women out of their natural place, of men being too much like women. And yet Rococo pink, constructed as feminine, especially when worn by men, was also intimately aligned with the challenges presented by elite manners and appearance to these binary notions of gender, to the idea that men and women were opposite sexes. This is an idea that was promoted by many Enlightenment thinkers. It also meant that pink had the power to subvert gender norms, even as it helped to reinforce or define racial norms in terms of skin color or even in terms of color more generally. And I want to suggest that we might understand Journoux's portrait particularly as subverting or resisting the usual gender binaries. The boutonniere that he is wearing, the rose boutonniere, these very sensuous pink lips that I'll talk about a little bit more, the deliberately elegant and even seductive languor of this portrait, I think, which comes especially clear when you look at it in comparison to another portrait of another sitter that Perron noted at exactly the same time. I think that there's quite a lot going on in the Journoux portrait in terms of undercutting norms of gender and masculinity. So understood in relation to red, it's easy to understand why pink would be a color embraced by men as well as women. Red, which unlike pink seems never to have been a gendered color, was, as I've already said, expensive. It signified richness, opulence, power, authority, war, in the case of images like this. For its partisans, and this is another warrior in pink here. Related to red, but different from red, pink also had the virtue of being a quite novel color, and in that sense it satisfied, at least for a time, the never-ending desire of the fashionable for what was new. By wearing pastels, including pink, of course, one also stood out from the bright colors that by the 18th century had become more widely available to everyone else, and this included red, and I'm just showing you here another example of a sort of cross-class spectrum of people in red, from artists to philosophers like Diderot, saloniers, wealthy saloniers such as Madame Geoffrin up there. So wearing pink or being portrayed in pink or as pink, which I think is kind of what's going on in these two portraits, was for both sexes a means of demonstrating class distinction or aspirations. Men who wore pink were certainly also, I think, resisting, perhaps even presenting a riposte to the so-called great masculine renunciation that was beginning to happen in the last quarter of the 18th century. This renunciation involved the rejection of color in men's dress, an inclination instead towards plain, sober colors, a lack of ostentation and adornment in dress, and this renunciation of color also had moral and political as well as gender implications. Like other colors, like red, like blue, pink then was associated with expressions of class identity, prestige, and privilege. But I want to suggest that in some cases at least, pink signified also another kind of prestige having to do with racial privilege. On the latter point, I'm building on a recent study of Pompadour and pink in relation to Boucher's portrait of Pompadour at her toilette. This study asks what was the significance of pink skin in a moment in which race is coming to be defined in terms of color. What did it mean to display oneself in the act of constructing pink skin? And just note as an aside that the toilette certainly didn't have to be figured in terms of pink and white, as you can see in the very different sort of palette of these two other images of contemporaneous images of women at the toilette. So it was very much a concerted choice on the part of the artist and the sitter. The study that I was just referring to makes the convincing case that, among other things, the emphasis on pink skin in Boucher's portrait signaled white racial privilege and can be understood as a codification of race. And I would add that the Fogg portrait relates to the larger cultural context, going back to the theorist Leblond that I mentioned, in which pink has become the primary emblem of white skin, racially white skin, and by extension is emblematic also of racial privilege. Considered in such a context, what might it mean then to wear pink clothing? Or more particularly, what might it mean if we understand clothing, as recent scholarship has done, not only as a bearer of symbolism, as communicating and expressing identities, but as a second skin? To reflect on this question a bit, this idea that clothing can be understood as a kind of second skin, I turn to one of the most beautiful portraits of a man in pink that I know of. I've shown it to you a number of times now, Perronneau's portrait of Bernard-Olivier Journoud. This was one of a number of portraits that Perronneau made while in Bordeaux from 1756 to 58, during which time members of the Journoud clan and other prominent Bordelais families sat to him. The Journouds were his most important clients. He made at least 6 portraits of family members. I show some of them here. During his sojourn, Perronneau stayed in the same street where the Journoud family lived, in an hôtel particulier that housed most of this very numerous family. There were 12 sons and 6 daughters. This was also the locale of the spice and drugs business that, along with sugar refining, were the foundation of the Journouds' magnificent fortune. The house was situated in the heart of the thriving quarter of Bordeaux that did a booming business in colonial commodities in which the Journouds traded. In the 18th century, in fact, Bordeaux supplied the majority of Europe with coffee, cocoa, sugar, cotton, and indigo, and its Port of the Moon was one of France's busiest. Bordeaux was also the major center for the slave trade in France, even though theoretically there were no slaves in France. These inescapable truths defined the physical context of Perronneau's making of these portraits, and I think inflect their cultural and socio-historical significance. At the time, the House of Journoud, which was run by the 4 eldest brothers, of which Olivier was one, was becoming involved in shipping, and they would soon become one of the most successful shipping companies in Bordeaux, engaged in the direct shipping of colonial commodities, all products of enslaved labor, between France and Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti. Their wealth enabled them to rise to political and judicial influence, and finally to a peerage. At the time that these portraits were made, the Journoud frères were not yet engaged directly in the triangular trade with Africa. Later they would do that too. But they amassed their tremendous wealth through the direct involvement with a system of commerce that was intrinsically bound to traffic in African slaves. These are uncomfortable realities behind the patronage of many of Perronneau's works. But it seems to me that there is also something more at work in these particular portraits of men in pink, and of the women, in fact. The Journouds were social climbers whose aspirational claims to class superiority were enabled by their elite economic status. Those aspirations are articulated in these portraits through the luxury of dress and accoutrements, and perhaps also through their commanding frontality. But the family's aspirations and the means by which they achieved them were also founded on an explicit and immediate belief in white racial superiority, rather than on the no less pernicious assumption of whiteness as the unraced norm. For the Journouds, slavery and the racial ideologies that were used to justify it cannot have been distant abstractions. For them, slavery was not something that could be forgotten or ignored, as it was for most people when they put sugar in their coffee or chocolate, or when they applied their rouge or used their pastel crayons or paint made from Brazil wood or cochineal, supplied by merchants such as the Journaux. What's more, in Bordeaux, as in other slave trading ports, the slave trade was everywhere visible in the city, both in terms of its inhabitants and in representations all over the city. And the painting I'm showing you here on the right is this vignette in the lower part of the scene, which is part of the ceiling decoration for the Grand Théâtre in Bordeaux. Is one of the few examples I've seen that actually shows enslaved people, but it's quite unusual in that respect. It speaks to this point I'm making about the sort of undeniable visibility of enslaved people in Bordeaux. And what I want to get at is that slavery directly enabled and defined who the Journaux were. And I want to forward the idea that Perronneau cannot have been unaware of these realities. So with all of this in mind, it's especially difficult to see any of Bordeaux's Bordelais sitters in a neutral light in terms of race. Because whiteness could so readily be figured by pinkness, this is particularly true of the portraits of sitters wearing pink. And I'm showing you some other examples, some of the sitters related to the Journaux, others, such as the woman you see in the middle here, Madame Perouti, who was a Creole, so a European who's born in the French colonies, whose wealth derived directly from her plantations in Saint-Domingue. In this exquisite portrait of Olivier Journaux, Perronneau was undoubtedly at the height of his powers. He vividly captures a sense of the sitter's confident, maybe entitled, self-possession. He's a man whose demeanor is at once alert and elegantly, deliberately languorous. The artist masterfully captured the glowing, peachy pink luster of Journaux's complexion, which rhymes so evocatively with his rose boutonniere, and suggests analogies between his complexion and the flower that gave pink its name in French. Perronneau creates a visual affinity between them that invites direct comparison between his fair, white complexion and the blushing tea roses, which may well, again, as I suggested before, evoke a non-normative ideal of masculinity. Those roses as an adornment is very unusual in a portrait of a man. But if the Journaux lacks the high coloring on his cheeks that one might expect in a portrait of a woman, his lips are seductively heightened with this pinky red. But most of the couleur de rose here is displaced magnificently onto the vaporously dusky pink red of his velvet coat. It calls to mind the associations between couleur de rose and the complexion. This suit, which has sometimes been described as the true subject of the painting, is like a second skin, in which Journaux seems as comfortable and confidently insouciant as he clearly is in his first. And also, just thinking about pastel, I wanted to note that with its emphasis on the pink of the lips, maybe I'll just go back to this for a moment, this pastel, I think, really calls attention to the medium of pastel itself. As 18th century commentators often noted, the use of pastel here calls to mind the rouge and powder that were applied to actual faces of white women and men, often to highlight their whiteness. Rouge was made from the same colorants as the pastels in the clothing worn by sitters. And as one scholar has pointed out, in a colonial economy in which skin and fabric colorants traveled to Europe aboard the same ships that transported enslaved people across the Atlantic, the two domains of the toilette and slavery were intimately entwined. I would add that pastel and paints made from such materials were also part of that intimate association. Through this association with cosmeticized white skin, the very medium of pastel, like rouge itself, at least sometimes, can be seen to evoke the norm of whiteness, of which the portrait of Olivier Journaux, painted in pastel, wearing a pink suit, is practically a manifesto. Now, I would not wish to say that everyone who wore pink was so directly implicated in the racial ideology that resonates through the Journaux portrait. But I do want to point to the fact that just as white clothing, just to give you some more examples, often served to fetishize white skin, to dress in pink or to be represented in pink represented a codification of whiteness. I've also tried to highlight here how the material history of pink pigments informs its meanings in portraiture and in the meanings of the portraits. When the color pink came from tangible materials of colonialism, as it so often did, it was always already inflected with matters of race and the racial injustices of slavery. At a minimum, the lexical associations between pink and complexion as the color of white skin encoded pink as a symbol of ideal racialized whiteness. Pink, in other words, becomes the color of a kind of generic racial whiteness. In the end, the color pink in its myriad shades, worn by people of all ages and sexes, could have a huge range of meanings in the 18th century. Then, as now, a man who wore pink was making a statement, even if it was not always the statement that it might at first appear to be. Thanks. Sure, I'm happy. If I wear you out. Yes, anyone has questions for me? Yes, please.
So you mentioned the shells earlier.
Yeah.
Specifically the conch shells on the screen. To me, those are kind of evocative, and I wondered, maybe the language of the Rococo in particular, could that have maybe been like a thinly veiled reference, just the pervasiveness of being related to the shells, to like the fleshiness of female genitalia?
I think that that's certainly an association that is made later on very explicitly in the 19th century. Verlaine writes poetry about the shell as a kind of metaphor for female genitalia. I think that it certainly can contribute to the sense that pink is feminine. I have never seen, in this kind of essentializing way, I have never seen any direct reference, which doesn't mean that it's not something that occurred to people in the 18th century. I've never seen it as a kind of explicit evocation of femininity in that way, as a kind of bodily reference. But I think it's definitely an element in the, and are you thinking in terms of pinkness being associated with femininity through shells, or just the...
I don't know, because I think building the case that like it could be associated with skin, that was kind of where
Yeah.
it's very often, my experience of kind of pictorial themes being
Yeah.
18th century being synonymous for different genitalia both sides.
No, I think it's very possible. It's a good point. Yeah.
Is there a publication available that contains all these gorgeous portraits of people in pink?
Pending. By me, yes. I'm sure there will be others, but I have a version of this coming out, the Art Bulletin of the National Museum of Stockholm. It won't have all of them, but it'll have a lot of them. Most of them are, a lot of them are in Sweden. For some reason, I realize this is as much a paper about Roslin, the husband of the artist I'm working on, as it is about Perronneau. I realize Roslin really uses a lot of pink, so a lot of the ones that I showed are by him.
Like next year, right?
Yeah, I hope so.
I have a comment regarding
Yes, hi.
era during which in the 18th century, where Rococo was altogether frilly, exciting, and you showed that one painting of Watteau on the swing, which was actually very lascivious because the guy at the bottom looking under her skirt, and it was all extremely flirtatious.
Yeah.
And it fits in the 18th century. I'm not really a fan of Rococo, but I think it's certainly had its place at the time.
Yeah, I completely concur. I showed that work as a kind of emblem of the Rococo. What I was trying to say is that as much as we sort of think of the Rococo having received these ideas, I think, from the 18th century, we tend to think of all of those elements, the frilliness, the pink, the levity, all that stuff as feminine. What I'm kind of trying to get at is that is a constructed idea, and that I don't think that, people who participated in the Rococo at the time necessarily thought of it that way, that it's really a kind of critical construction that's imposed on the Rococo. Absolutely. One of my favorite paintings in the Wallace collection. It's been cleaned. It's absolutely gorgeous. They got rid of all the ugly yellow varnish, and it's spectacular. So, any others?
Yeah, one more thing. How prevalent was slavery in France at that time? Was it just for the very rich, or was it in all levels.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a point of contention amongst scholars about how much slavery was really present as an institution in France. And I think the legalities of, the gap between theory and practice was great, because in theory, there were supposed to be no enslaved people on French soil. It was supposed to be relegated purely to the colonies. The reality is that, particularly in those port cities that were engaged in the slave trade, there were slaves, and there were enslaved people who were living in those cities. Much less common, I think, in places like Paris, but like Thomas Jefferson brought, there were Americans who brought their slaves with them, and that they were legally free there, but then they got help from the French, who made them, when they tried to leave their masters, who were very willing to help them recuperate their property. So there was, as I say, a kind of real gap between. I mean, we have some statistics and numbers about, freed people of color and people who were enslaved, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but there is great scholarship on the subject done by historians. Yeah.
I couldn't help thinking of one of the most famous people that was called Rose of the time, Empress Josephine, who was called that by her family until Napoleon didn't like it, maybe, or
right.
But it's just so interesting in that, in light of all this, that she was on a colony, in Martinique, and they're going to actually call, they liked pink so very much, they're going to actually call a daughter that, and I would say it would be inflected with all those socio-cultural sort of attributes,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I stopped before we get to the revolution, really, but I think a continuation of thinking about these themes would have to take into account Josephine, Rose, as one of the most sort of conspicuous, high-profile, examples of a Creole woman who, interestingly, had this name, and who was really involved also with. Anyway, yeah, I'll leave it at that. But yes, you're absolutely right. I just for sake of time and efficiency, but I completely agree. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Thank you. Hi.
To kind of piggyback off of what she asked,
Yeah.
I was curious if there was a specific social event or political event that kind of acted as a catalyst that caused pink to become the forefront for that ideology. And then going off of that, was there, leading up to the French Revolution towards the end of the 18th century, was there any sort of depiction or carryover of pink into the new Reformation of Europe?
Just to go back for a second, when you say that any turning point for that ideology, which part do you mean?
Yeah, so like how pink became more favorable for, depicting a fair skin or complexion. Mm-hmm. You brought up how that kind of contrasted, or they would use enslaved people to contrast that in their artistic depictions. Was there any sort of, a war or an Enlightenment period or, some sort of quote-unquote Renaissance that came about that caused that to kind of become popular?
Mm. I mean, I don't know that we can, no, I don't think there's any one thing that we can point to. I mean, I was thinking about this in terms of some of the reasons that pink becomes so fashionable. And I think that it does have to do with the availability of these dye stuffs that now make it possible to have some snazzy new color that everybody is, that not everyone can wear. But the fact that color becomes more available and that the fashion for it coincides with this historical moment when race is beginning to emerge as a category that is defined in terms of skin color. I don't know that there's a causal relationship there necessarily, but they come to relate to one another, I think. And I don't know. I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, but I don't think there's one. I don't think there's any single turning point. But pink becomes the focus of this kind of anti-pink campaign around the middle of the century as part of the critique of the Rococo. So there are all these kind of different things that come together in mid-century, I think. You start seeing it. Yeah, thanks. Great questions.
Thank you so much, Melissa Hyde, for that amazing, interesting lecture. I'm really interested in the act of blushing and this idea of blushing associated with whiteness and the ability to blush, and how blushing is also associated with modesty and virtue in women. So how is that related to the fashionability of pink and in men as well?
Yeah. I didn't talk about that. I mean, it's a really important aspect of the whole argument, I think, though. And you may know Angela Rosenthal's article that's about, it's particularly about the British context, but about precisely those things that you're talking about. But I think that in the context of race, that the whole idea that women can blush, and that blushing is a sign of modesty and all of those things that you rightly point to, is also a mark of race, right? It kind of codifies, it's part of this new ideal about whiteness and femininity and virtue being a function of whiteness. Because there's a whole discourse about whether, and debate about whether dark-skinned people can blush, and what that means in terms of their moral makeup and that sort of thing. And it contributes to some of the arguments that dark-skinned people are not human, and they're not, don't have the kind of moral universe or potential that that white-skinned people do. And so, yeah. Again, I'm not sure if I start talking, and then I'm not sure if I've answered the question, but I think I would look at, if you're interested in it, I would look at Angela Rosenthal's. It's a fabulous article in Art History. It was published quite some time ago, but and she really talks about that in the context of race. How that relates to, I mean, I do think that there's a direct relationship between blushing, whether artificial or real, and the fashion for pink. Whether men ever blush is a whole thing I guess I haven't really thought about, because it's not connected to modesty, certainly when men wear pink. I think that's part of why I think there's so much of a question of race when it comes to men in pink, although not only men in pink. Yeah. Great, thanks, great questions.
I think I'm probably going to draw this to a close because it's such a rich topic, and obviously there's a lot of fascination with it. So we're really going to look forward to your future publications on the topic. One thing I would just sort of observe, and I do find your argument completely compelling, is just as a way of highlighting the basic argument, which is that color is not implicitly anything, that color is a floating signifier in the classical sense, and that it can kind of denote anything, but within this specific framework that you're arguing in terms of the hardening of gender classification, which is basically what you identified with the Rococo and with its revilement by so many of these critics. The thing that maybe can complicate it, especially in this particular part of European history, is also the whole status of the exotic and the exotic other, and then the way in which this fascination with pastels also intersects with the opening up of these other areas of color in Asia, for example, and how that kind of also starts to color the whole way in which these things signify, and that's a whole other strand, I'm sure, of thinking that could go into it. But it also just brings to mind how whiteness is so monolithically, insistently created to efface the actual difference between different kinds of white people, which in itself is an insufferable disservice. So it's not, it sort of cuts both ways, doesn't it? And sometimes I wonder whether or not that is brought up enough.
Yeah, I mean, the cutting across, yes, absolutely. I think, the things I was pointing to about cutting across class, I could have said, and, well, maybe I couldn't, but I can borrow from you. Thank you, that's great.
But anyway, thank you
Thank
so
you,
much for your
everyone.
attention.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Melissa. That was really wonderful.
Thank you.